Hello, and welcome to this presentation about form and empathy in film. My name is Tess Lankhuizen, and I'm a PhD candidate working on a DFK-funded research project at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, under the supervision of Katalin, Balint and Elly, Konijn, and with the assistance of Mattia, Savardi and Sergio, Benini at the University of Brescia. Together with my co-authors, I'm looking into the question if and how form affects the empathy-eliciting potential of popular film scenes. In speaking about form or style, I mean to refer to the stylistic properties of a narrative, as defined by the affordances of the medium said narrative is told in. In this research, we chose to focus on the visual form of film, so features related to things like editing, cinematography, and mise en scène. And this immediately introduces one of the main challenges of the research, namely, the struggle with the large amount of formal features that could be considered when looking into the influence of form on viewer empathy. Just within a single frame of film, we could consider composition, lighting, color, and saturation, and wouldn't even have begun to cover all possible formal elements. That's not even mentioning things like motion, cut rate, or the juxtaposition of images through editing. And of course, while some of these features might affect empathy directly, others might have an indirect effect and complicate the picture. At this point in the project, we've completed an extensive quantitative formal analysis of a set of Hollywood film scenes, and I've prepared the collection of viewer response data relating to these scenes, which will be completed later this month. At the same time, we've been working on a comprehensive model to frame and summarize our hypotheses, and I would like to take this presentation as an opportunity to pitch this model and ask for your input. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, we are operating under the assumption that it's not actually a question if formal features can impact viewer empathy. The idea that they can has been part of cognitive film studies right from the beginning, borrowed from Russian formalism. We see this notion echoed in both academic and in non-academic case studies of film, as well as by filmmakers themselves when they describe how they go about crafting their films. And, perhaps most convincingly, in recent years we've seen a growing body of empirical evidence of form affecting viewer experiences, even when considered independent from narrative context. But to understand these observations, we need more careful exploration of how these effects work. With this project, we've decided to go about this with an exploratory quantitative approach. Data collection for this study can be split up into 3 parts. First, we sampled film scenes that can reasonably be expected to elicit empathy in the average viewer, and that are of similar cultural background and quality. Second, the scenes were analyzed for their formal features, using both algorithmic and manual analysis. Third and finally, viewer response data was gathered from participants who each viewed one of the sampled scenes. Sampling the scenes that would serve as both subject and stimulus took place in 2 steps. In the first step, we defined a sampling pool of suitable films and drew a random sample of 100 films, maximizing the inclusion of different creators. In the second step, we segmented these films to identify individual scenes, drawing a second random sample of 1 scene per film for all eligible scenes. In doing so, we observed the sampling criteria shown on screen. As mentioned, one of the purposes of these criteria was to identify scenes that could reasonably be expected to elicit empathy. We did this by only including films with a dramatic element, as dramas generally rely on the viewer's emotional and empathic engagement for their proper enjoyment. We also only included scenes that conveyed a single and complete narrative unit that could be understood separate from the context of the film, and that featured at least one identifiable human character experiencing some sort of conflict. A second purpose of the sampling criteria was to ensure a degree of homogeneity in the sample. Thus, the scenes had to be from films with a similar cultural background, intended audience, and quality, which led us to sample from recent mainstream American releases that were well received by both audiences and critics. Having sampled our scenes, we set to analyzing their formal features. To do this, we mainly used algorithms developed by our co-authors from Brescia, and complemented these data with manual analysis of those formal features that could not be coded digitally. The formal features under investigation are listed here. All were included because of theoretical or empirical work suggesting they might be relevant in empathy elicitation. One of the questions we had while analyzing these formal features was if there would be similarities across scenes that might indicate a sort of style of empathy, suggesting filmmakers made similar stylistic decisions in scenes intended to elicit empathy. The answer to this question is, well, no. the findings did not provide any evidence for some sort of stylistic formula that filmmakers apply. In fact, some features varied quite a bit across scenes. But we did find evidence indicating recurring trends within these scenes. One of the first things that stood out to us was that close-ups were by far the most common shot skill used, and that, on average, frames depicted at least one human face. It seems that empathy-eliciting scenes seek to close the perceived distance between viewer and character. Meanwhile, the ratio of long shots was small and fairly stable across scenes, but the ratio of medium shots showed a strong negative correlation with the ratio of close-ups. At the same time, the ratio of close-ups had a positive correlation with shot rate, meaning that faster-paced scenes tended to include more close-ups. This may be explained by findings by Konijn and Armstrong, who established that it takes viewers less time to read faces depicted in close-up than in more distant scales. This allows for tighter editing without risking confusion when using close-ups. Or, the other way around, it encourages the use of close-ups in faster-paced scenes. Principal component analysis of the formal features showed background clutter, motion, brightness, and saturation variance to be related, negatively so in the case of saturation variance. Correlation analysis confirmed these results and also indicated shot rate positively correlated with many of these variables. This component alone captured 33% of all variance in the formal features. This is interesting because research from the 1990s and early 2000s has firmly established that several of the variables in this component, namely motion and shot rate, can cue orienting responses and arouse viewers. In other words, they automatically draw the attention and thus increase mental resources available for message processing and comprehension. But these same features can, together with background clutter, raise the visual complexity of a video to the point of mental overload and confusion. The negative correlation with saturation variance and the positive correlation with brightness within this component might indicate that filmmakers chose to minimize variation in color intensity and maximize visibility in empathy-eliciting scenes rich in these attention-grabbing cues. This might be to prevent mental overload while still benefiting from the orienting responses that follow cuts and motion. Variables related to editing also indicate that a smooth and comprehensible viewing experience is essential to empathy-eliciting scenes. Most scenes favored central compositions and rarely contained more than one focal point per frame. This focal point remained fairly stable across shots, reducing the amount of eye movements the viewer would have to make to follow the point of interest. In addition to this, shot length also remained fairly stable within scenes, and it was rare for scenes to combine very long with very short takes, indicating empathy-eliciting scenes generally maintain a constant pace. Finally, visual shot coherence was generally high within all scenes, indicating that few shots introduced visual information that was radically different in chromaticity and luminosity from the preceding shot. This likely implies an overall preference for editing involving shots that share a close visual relationship with each other. Based on these results, we might conclude that the creators of empathy-eliciting scenes concern themselves with attention, comprehension, and accessibility when making stylistic decisions, creating a smooth viewing experience that brings viewers closer to the character on screen. At this point, I'd like to return to the framework I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. Based on what we found so far, it seems it would be insufficient to only look at the direct effect of form on viewer state empathy. With this in mind, we've laid out a hypothetical model including a number of, we believe, important mediators and moderators, depicted here. This model captures the three ways in which we think form mainly impacts viewer empathy, based on existing theories and previous empirical work. Firstly, some formal features may affect state empathy directly. In particular, we expect features that relate to perceived closeness and the visibility of actors' faces to significantly impact empathy. Previous research by Balint, Rooney, and others has already established a link between close-ups and empathy. In keeping with these findings, our data also show that close-ups are the norm for all the empathy-eliciting scenes in our sample. Neuroscientific research into empathy has firmly established patterns of neural resonance between observer and observed, which may indicate that the mere observation of others allows us to automatically and intuitively grasp their experience. Scholars such as Galese and Guerra have proposed that this embodied simulation is essential to our empathic experience with film. Secondly, The effect of form on viewer empathy may be mediated through attention and comprehension. As mentioned before, previous research has consistently shown how formal features such as motion and cuts can grab the attention and facilitate or complicate comprehension, most prominently explained in Lang's limited capacity model. Now, what's important about this is that both attention and comprehension are known factors in narrative engagement, and attention in particular may be considered a prerequisite to empathy. Finally, certain features may impact arousal, emotional valence, and perceived emotional intensity through the emotive framing of story elements using angles, light, and saturation. These, in turn, may serve as mediators for viewer empathy. Though we understand empathy itself to be a social cognitive process rather than an emotion, it has an important affective component that may be indirectly impacted by the emotive framing of the scene. For example, the use of light and contrast might make a viewer more aroused, or perceive the emotions depicted to be more intense, resulting in a stronger empathic response. Now, obviously the next step is to gather some data and see if there's any sense in the hypotheses I just described, and that's what we're working on right now. Viewer response data will be collected through a pilot-tested online questionnaire distributed via Prolific, with each participant watching a randomly assigned scene. To account for the fact that some participants will have watched the same scene, we plan on exploring our hypotheses using multi-level analysis. As we're now going through the final checks before data collection, we thought this an excellent time to get some feedback on our approach and hypotheses. With that said, I look forward to hearing from you later this week. Until then, thank you for watching and see you soon.